Hey there, Big George.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for joining.
Hey, I'm good, George. I'm good.
Good.
You know what? I'm gonna be out of town on the 7th, so I mean not the 7th, the 10th.
Today is the 7th.
I mean the 10th.
Okay.
So I think I'm planning on it, but if not, I will attend.
Okay.
I appreciate you. I appreciate the invite.
Oh, and I appreciate you attending these meetings when you can. Thanks for your support.
Yeah.
Hi, David. Thanks for joining.
Yes. All right.
All right.
Thank you. Have a lot of fun. Bowl 300.
All right. I'll see you later.
Okay. Bye.
Okay.
My wife's bowling tonight.
Yeah, sounds like you
Yeah.
should be there.
Yeah, she's down Long Beach. They're bowling some tournament down there. So hopefully she'll go down there and bowl 300 and she'll be a happy camper.
Yeah, good. Bring back a prize of some sort.
Yeah. Well, they have they got these little different pots that they like total games, people under certain average pots, and they really do it up right. So I just wanted to win. And make
Good.
sure.
And how come you're not? Are you in a team?
No. Matter of fact, to tell you the truth, I got her bowling because I used that for an excuse for her to come over to my place when I was out in college because I didn't want to go home and I didn't want her to go home and tell her mom that she just went over to my place to see me, so we went bowling. And so I was able to tell her mom that, and truthfully, she would come over, and it was a bowling alley that was not too far from my from where I lived. I lived off campus, and we went bowling.
Recording is on.
So, and then she kept it up. She's been doing it ever since, and I think she was 19 at the time.
So just a few years ago.
Oh yeah, we'll let her tell it. Let her tell it. Yeah.
Still a little bit early, so
Mm-hmm.
we'll wait till at least 5:30. See who we manage to attract.
Yeah, I like to get in a little early because that way it makes sure I have no technical problems because I'm no technical genius. So
Hey, I have the same worry each time I'm supposed to lead one of these meetings.
yeah, I guess I'd rather be early and wait till the last minute and find out I got a technical problem.
Commissioner Rahman, you have a big week coming up with the Super Bowl.
I do, yeah. It's a long week. They start coming into town on Wednesday already.
Okay. That's going to be something else.
Yeah, because I heard that they have events scheduled for the 3 days in Santa Monica as well, but I don't know what those events are, and I think one of them is supposed to be in the Santa Monica Pier and one on the promenade, so I don't know how.
They're broadcasting on the pier on Sunday.
Yeah.
So that's going to attract a large crowd, I think.
They have a pre-Super Bowl party.
A free Super Bowl party.
No, a pre.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what all that's going to look like, but I'm sure traffic is going to be busy. So.
Yeah. And I heard the teams are actually staying in hotels in Santa Monica.
Some of the hotels have the teams, yeah. Yeah, most of the hotels are at capacity, so we'll see.
Commissioner Palazzolo, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I think Commissioner Basari, thanks for joining us. Long-term community member and police reform advocate, Michelle Riddick is on the line.
Good evening. Good evening.
Good to see you. Commissioner Centeno, welcome. Looks like you had a bad day of golf.
Talking to me? I'm sorry, just trying to get my computer to work. That was to me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Well, every day is a bad day, but also every day is a good day.
Yeah. I can understand that.
Yeah.
Looks like we have
actually didn't
Commissioner
do
Miller.
too bad today, but it was good. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. I was just acknowledging. It looks like Commissioner Miller has joined us.
Recording is on.
And we're looking good for a quorum.
Good and good evening.
This committee.
I have a question. When
Yes, sir.
when you're muted in this program, is there a shortcut like in Zoom where you can just press the space bar to temporarily unmute?
Oh, you're beyond my capabilities now. So, yeah, I don't know the answer to that. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Let me recognize and say hello to our officers. Looks like Lieutenant Lucio and Officer Sumlin. Don't know your title exactly, but welcome.
Hello.
Hi, thank you.
Do we know if Deputy Chief Jacob is going to join us this evening?
I assume so.
Okay. Good. Well, we'll try to hold on for a moment so he can join us.
Recording is on.
If you're not speaking, it's a good idea to go on mute. So Gene Martin there, can you go on mute?
Yes, I will.
Okay, and welcome Commissioner Devermont, Vice Chair Devermont, I should say. Glad you could join us. We have a quorum plus, but we're going to try to wait a few minutes to see if the Deputy Chief is able to join us. Welcome, Ms. Berlin. Good to see you as always. Okay, it's 5:33, and I think we'll go ahead and get started. We have more than a quorum for this committee. I think we just have 3 members of the committee, but if I omit your name, let me know. We have myself, we have Vice Chair Devermont, and we have Commissioner Centeno as committee members. And then, so that's a full slate of committee members. And plus we have several other commissioners on the line. So what we're going to do tonight is I'll make a few introductory remarks. Can everyone go on mute, please? I'll make a few introductory remarks. I'll introduce our guests, and then I'll read the agenda item, and then we'll take some public input, and then we'll proceed. And welcome, Deputy Chief Jacob. Thank you for joining us. So let me start by just introducing folks that will be speaking tonight. And if you're not speaking and you're not a commissioner, I would urge you to turn your video off. So let's start by introducing Deputy Chief Derek Jacob. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, and again, let's formally welcome Lieutenant Sal Lucio.
Hello, thank you.
Yeah,
Yep.
good. And Officer Sumlin, welcome. And then
Thank you.
I've invited some guests from the Stanford Center for Racial Justice. And if our staff members could turn on their video, I'll do a brief introduction. So we have several staff members and attorneys. We have Attorney Wang Pham, Attorney Elias Rodriguez, Attorney Oluwadamalola Animashan. Thank you all for participating, and you guys will go off camera until it's time to speak. And we have one of our volunteer attorneys, David Rubin. You turn on your camera and say hello, Attorney Rubin.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Good, thanks. And I'll say more on that later, but you all know I have one of my hats I wear is as Executive Director for the Stanford Center for Racial Justice, and I've invited them to come and provide some input to our committee. So after that introduction, let me also say that we've got a few attorneys on the line. They're not representing anybody other than if they're speaking for the Stanford Center for Racial Justice. That's the only capacity they're in. And no one's giving legal advice or legal opinions, and nothing anyone says is intended to be such. I also want to say that that this is our first meeting of the Use of Force Systems Committee, and as you all know, use of force systems in policing is among the most important areas our commission should be paying attention to and understand. The policies and training and systems of accountability that SMPD uses potentially impacts the safety of all the people in Santa Monica on any given day, including the officers. And use of force policy instructs on when officers are legally allowed to use violence, also known as force, to compel individuals to submit or to accomplish their law enforcement goals. And so as a committee, the approach that I've suggested and will be implementing is that we have a careful review of the key elements of the Santa Monica use of force policy, so that we understand it, and later to understand the training and reporting that goes along with it. And we want to do that in a public setting because an important element of 21st century community-oriented policing is to have public dialogue about the most important policy issues and other issues affecting public safety in the city, and ultimately to co-produce public safety with the community and the department working together. So we will want to understand whether SMPD use of force policies reflect the best practices in community-oriented policing, as directed by City Council in September 2020. Also, I wanted to kind of set the ground rules and say that The approach that I prefer for all of our committees and for our commission is that on most issues, there'll be some exceptions, but we're not here tonight to have a debate. I'm not advancing any proposal. I'm not proposing any changes to the policy. What we're trying to do is be in a learning phase and to understand how Santa Monica's use of force policy works, and then to hear another perspective on how what you'll learn about Stanford Center for Racial Justice's model use of force policy project, how that might compare, all for the benefit of understanding where things stand and how it might compare to some other approaches. Tonight, I want to focus on two key aspects of the use of force policy. I think they may be among the most important aspects. One is the threshold for authorizing an officer to use force. And then once force is authorized, what the standards are for the application of force. And my plan, the structure for how I would expect to do this committee meeting is I would, I'll ask SMPD to go first and provide an overview.
Recording is on.
Basic questions to use as prompts to kind of walk through the questions. And then before I have commissioner back and forth, I plan to have the two representatives from the Stanford Center for Racial Justice discuss the same issues and how it compares to the model use of force policy project. And then we'll take questions from commissioners and have a dialogue about that. Now what I'm going to do is call the agenda item and then take public comment. So since Ms. Parson isn't here, I will undertake to do that on my own. So agenda item 3, study session, review and discussion of review and discussion of SMPD use of force policy, SMPD presentation regarding how use of force policy is developed and maintained, including use of Lexipol as outside vendor, SMPD presentation regarding standard for authorizing use of force, including deadly force, and regarding what level of force standard is used when authorized, presentation by Stanford Center for Racial Justice regarding its model use of force policy project, and comparisons to the SMPD use of force standard for authorization and use of force. And so with that, let me ask if there are members of the public who wish to speak. And if so, turn on your camera so I can see you. I see Ms. Berlin has her hand raised. Please turn on your camera and go ahead. And please try to keep it to 2 minutes.
I'm having trouble turning my camera back on. Oh, I could do it up here. Okay. All right. Okay. Yes, I'm very pleased that we have this meeting tonight and the expertise I'm looking forward to hearing for what is considered by some folks to be the best standards on this. This is an issue that I happen to be a person who is the coordinator of the Committee for Racial Justice in Santa Monica. We've been in existence for over 10 years. And we are also a part of the Coalition for Police Reform, which has been in existence since about 2014 or so. When we first looked at the use of force policies back then, it was like a page or two, and there was not one word about de-escalation in the whole policy. So I'm pleased to see at least this one that seems to be the most recent one from September of 2021, the use of force policy for Santa Monica PD. does at least talk about de-escalation, about forced de-escalation. But we also always were questioning in the past. We've been through several police chiefs in this time, and we questioned about Lexapol, the use of Lexapol to draft these particular policy, any policy, but particularly use of force. And they always kind of poo-pooed that it's Lexapol and said that it was, they can use it as a reference, but they, kind of write their own. I have to say, in trying to read this 15-page document, it's at the bottom. It does mention that it comes from Lexapol, so I'm disappointed in that, and I do look forward to hearing what people have to say tonight. I believe that de-escalation is not talked about often enough when discussing use of force. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So, Deputy Chief Jacob, I had a few prompting questions. I don't know if you had a general statement you wanted to make, but I'm happy to just ask you a few kind of general questions and get your answers, and then anything else you want to add after that would be fine with me. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Sure. So generally, let's start with how does the public go about finding SMPD's use of force policy? And then also, how is it used by the department?
Oh, so the use of force policy.
Softballs too, yes.
Yeah, no, right, exactly. So our use of force policy is obviously it's found on our website, on our webpage. We have a new webpage. Well, it was on our old one, but now we have a new one. So our use of force policy is there. So included in our use of force is our general use of force, where we're talking about general, but then also use of force encompasses use of weapons, use of firearms, use of less lethal, use of certain devices. So it's an overall general type of deal that's covered under our use of force policy. How it's crafted is dependent on, was that the second question? How is it crafted?
Well, it's basically, that is the next question, but the other question I had asked was, how's it used? Once it is crafted, what's the purpose of the policy in your view?
Sure. So obviously it's to make sure that we're in constitutional standards and also other legal standards and mandates that have happened throughout the country and about how we use force and why we use force and the justification for that. So obviously the overall umbrella is Graham versus Connor, and then it's shrunk down to several other mandates and several other court cases which have kind of narrowed scope. And we of course in the police department have narrowed our scope further on some of those particular instances and some of those uses of force and some of those force options that we do.
Okay.
If that kind of makes sense.
Okay, and then tell us how the policy gets maintained and updated, and who's responsible for changes and making updates.
Yeah, so as Ms. Berlin talked, we use Lexapol, which is a third-party vendor which uses case law, which uses particular, it keeps us up to standard and up to a point on all laws that are out there, best case practices. Then we can tweak those laws in ourselves to meet our own department. So it's not, contrary to popular belief, it's not a blanket policy that we follow. Our policy is our policy. Our policy doesn't look like Culver City's or Beverly Hills or any other police department. It looks like Santa Monica's. It adds what we add into it. We have a policy person who's assigned full-time to work policy. They update policy on a regular basis as things come. If there's a policy change that comes, like last year, we updated, or 2 years ago, within the last 2 years, we've updated our use of force policy 4 times. And what that happens, and that's because of legal changes, new laws that have come in that we've had to add into it to meet certain legislation. That policy is then has a review process that it goes through. following all the way up through the chain of command up to the chief, who reviews all policy, and then that policy is then changed at Lexipol and then included in our policy manual.
Just clarify that last part again, because one of my questions was whether it's whether Santa Monica controls the policy, and I think you said it does.
We
whether
do.
Lexipol controls the policy.
Lexipol is the platform that holds all of our policies together. We control all of our policies. The Santa Monica.
So you could change a sentence or a section.
We have.
If Santa Monica decides to. Okay.
Yeah, we have.
Okay. All right. Let me ask you now a substantive question. So does Santa Monica Police Department use of force policy have a threshold for authorizing use of force? That's separate and apart from the standard. You know, is there kind of a condition that has to be satisfied before an officer can decide to use force?
Well, I mean, so force, right? So there's two different types of force, right? Well, not two different types, but should force be used to effect an arrest, or is force used to protect someone or to do something? So there's a bunch of different scenarios. So there isn't one exact scenario that fits any question. And I guess the answer is it depends. And so obviously we have the reasonable officer standard. And so would another reasonable officer with the same reasonable amount of training in the same scenario do the same particular force that they used? You know, would they do that? And officers are trained in the academy to recognize threats and to select the correct force option based on the threat or what's placed in front of them. And then they operate on that themselves. So if an officer feels that a firm grip or maybe a strong hold on someone to put their hands behind their back is what they need, that is still force, but it is inappropriate to hit that person with a baton if they're only offering passive resistance, if that makes sense to everyone. So,
yes,
so it's reasonable, necessary force, and I'm sure your attorneys will get into that later, but we're talking about is the force reasonable and is it necessary in the fact when they use it?
Okay. So force is authorized, if I understood you correctly, if the officer decides that it's reasonable under the circumstances. Is that an accurate way of saying it?
Excuse me, sir?
Is that an accurate way of saying that?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Under the
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, now, and then once force is authorized or the officer reasonably decides that it is necessary, what is the standard for how much force can be applied? You just mentioned an example that they could do this, but they couldn't do that. What's the standard? How would you describe it?
Well, again, it's the reasonable officer standard. So that's the standard that's the legal mandate. And so that's when folks, what would another particular officer, similar training, similar situation do in this particular circumstance? That standard is a reasonable officer standard. And then what happens then when an officer does use force, we here at the Santa Monica Police Department review all incidents of force. And so it has to meet a certain threshold. An officer is required to report that force. That force is then reviewed by a supervisor all the way up the chain of command to meet on all force scenarios. So every use of force that we use, even if that's a firm grip or if that is a baton strike, or even including the use of a firearm, all uses of force follow the same path. They must be reviewed. And in certain incidents, if they are in the force is involving a deadly force or it involves using a weapon of some sort, if there's critical bodily injury to whoever we're using the force to, or if it just needs to be looked at, it's looked at now by an independent review board that looks at that particular force. We have folks who are not involved in the situation who will look at body worn camera, look at the video, and then make a determination then if that force requires further investigation or not.
Okay, thank you. And then kind of last question is, how does the standard different for the use of deadly force?
Well, the use of deadly force as force is guaranteed by the law. Well, it's proposed by law. So AB 392, which just came out, which is now our AB 385, has a clear set of articulable facts and things that a police officer must do and must consider when using force. It's rather lengthy, but and it's a bunch of legal talk. And to that point of the 21 pages, that is also our officers are required to know. So the force must be reasonable. It must be necessary. It must be must be proportionate to the situation. Meaning, depending on whether the crime's doing, the force can't be greater than the crime that I'm already doing. It must consider the totality of the circumstances. So all these legal things, and it tells the officer that they also must consider mental illness. They must consider a litany of things before that force is used or before the deadly force is used, and all those check marks must be off.
Okay, great. Anything else you want to tell us about the use of force policy?
No, I think. Hang on a second. I'm sorry, my light turned off. My daughter. I also have Sergeant Sumlin, who's our use of force, one of our use of force experts. He's also helped out with you guys before in explaining our training procedures and what we do in force. So he's also our court-approved use of force expert. So he's on the line for any other questions when we start to talk about training or any specifics that we talk about.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate you being here and helping us out. When we get done with the other presenters, we'll have commissioner questions. So I'm sure there'll be some follow-up. All right, now can Attorney Wang Pham and Attorney David Rubin, can you turn your cameras on? There he is. Okay, good. Well, welcome again. Thank you for agreeing to come here and tell us a little bit about the Model Use of Force Policy Project. Let me just start off and ask, what is the Model Use of Force Policy Project?
Yeah, thanks everyone for having us here. It's really a delight of mine to be able to share our work with everybody. And just excuse if you hear my daughter bang on my door and scream at me. She's 1.5, and this is usually the time I'm playing with her, so she thinks I should be playing with her right now. But nonetheless, the Model Use of Force Policy Project is a project conducted by the Stanford Center for Racial Justice with assistance from Gibson, Dunn, and Crutcher LLP, and it's in collaboration with other Stanford researchers, law enforcement officials, policy experts, and grassroots organizers to create and implement a model policy that centers on fair, safe, and equitable approaches to the use of force. So our policy really reflects a community-oriented policing principles, and it can help improve, strengthen, and sustain trusting relationships between police departments and the communities they serve. But I think importantly, the Model Use of Force policy that we've developed seeks to enhance both public safety and officer safety by prioritizing the sanctity of human life as one of its core values. It's designed for turnkey implementation by small and mid-sized cities. And so, these are the cities that often don't have independent resources to develop their own. And for cities that are particularly interested in adopting an innovative 21st century use of force policy. We're currently in this qualification phase and expect to have a pilot project ready for implementation by the middle of this year.
Thanks. And can you describe how the draft Model Use of Force Policy was created?
Sure, so I'll take this one. Thank you very much for having us here. So Gibson Dunn got involved with this project in late 2020. And since that time, over 25 Gibson Dunn attorneys have contributed to researching and drafting the model policy, expending hundreds of hours on the project. And Gibson Dunn attorneys who have contributed to and reviewed the draft policy include multiple former federal prosecutors. So members of the Center for Racial Justice at Stanford and Gibson Dunn attorneys, we reviewed the use of force policies of over 100 cities, as well as model use of force policies promulgated by various non-governmental organizations. And this process also included a review of instances of police overreach and use of force across the country, not only police shootings, which have been covered by the national news media with more regularity, but also instances of violence against crowds and use of non-lethal force and police canines. The drafters identified and analyzed patterns in existing policies and developed a framework of standards that address is in policing while improving public safety. And finally, the drafters also analyzed state laws and case law to determine the legal framework within which the policy would be implemented, depending on the jurisdiction.
Thanks. Let's talk about the threshold for authorizing force. What does the model use of force policy require for use of force to be authorized?
So the draft model use of force policy, it has quite a few thresholds that need to be met in order for force to be authorized. First, the use of force is only authorized if it is necessary to carry out a lawful objective. And this is the first of 6 threshold standards that need to be met. And the policy specifically defines the 7 lawful objectives. So those objectives are conducting a lawful search.
If you're not on mute, could you please turn on your mute? It looks like Ms. Hirsch, maybe.
Okay.
That helps prevent the echo. Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sure. So, so that first lawful objective is conducting a lawful search. The second is preventing serious damage to property. The third is effecting a lawful arrest or detention. The fourth is gaining control of a combative suspect. The fifth is preventing or terminating the commission of a crime. Sixth is intervening in a suicide or self-inflicted injury. And 7 is defending an officer or person from the physical acts of another. So that's the first threshold standard. But the use of force is not allowed solely if it is necessary to achieve a lawful objective. In other words, the lawful objective requirement is necessary, but it is not sufficient to authorize use of force. In addition to being necessary to achieve a lawful objective, the officer must also have exhausted all other reasonable means to apprehend the suspect. The officer must issue a verbal warning prior to using force, if possible. The officer must use the minimum amount of force the officer reasonably believes is feasible to carry out the lawful purpose. The officer must reasonably believe that the level of force used will not injure innocent third parties, and the level of force must be necessary and proportional to carry out the lawful objective. And then finally, the policy requires officers to use de-escalation tactics and exhaust reasonable alternatives before using any kind of force.
Okay, thank you for that. Now, let's talk about comparisons to Santa Monica's policy. I take it you all have looked at both Santa Monica's use of force policy and compared it to the model use of force policy. How does it compare on the threshold issue of authorizing use of force?
Yeah, so I'll take this question. The main difference between our authorization to use force that David just discussed and Santa Monica's is that we have more requirements that need to be met in order for an officer to use force. As David also stated, there are 6 requirements that need to be met in order to authorize the use of force under our policy, whereas in Santa Monica's policy, there are 3 requirements to authorize use of force, which are first, the officer needs to use de-escalation techniques where feasible. Second, there must be a legitimate law enforcement purpose. And third, the standard for use of force must be met under Santa Monica's policy to authorize the use of force. So another difference between the 2 policies lies within the lawful objective requirement. So under our policy, as David stated, we strictly limit the lawful objectives to 7 circumstances. But under Santa Monica's policy, there are 4 stated lawful objectives in the policy. 1, to accomplish an arrest. 2, to prevent escape. 3, to overcome resistance. And 4, to lawfully seize and prevent the destruction of evidence. So most importantly, though, the Santa Monica policy leaves open a class of, quote, other legitimate law enforcement purposes. that are not stated in the policy. So even when we look at the lawful objective requirement of both policies, the model use of force policy doesn't just explicitly state more lawful objectives than the Santa Monica policy, but it also limits the number of lawful objectives to 7. So again, I think to just paint this picture, the main difference between our authorization to use force and Santa Monica's is that ours has more requirements that need to be met in order for an officer to use force.
Okay, and what about, is there a different standard for, under the model policy, for authorizing the use of deadly force? I guess that's for you, Attorney Rubin.
Sure. So deadly force is only authorized when all of the standards that I just described are met. But in addition, the use of deadly force can only be used in certain circumstances that rise above that level. So the use of deadly force can only be used if it is absolutely, pardon me, if it's absolutely necessary to protect an officer or member of the public from imminent death or serious bodily harm that is more likely than not to occur without the use of force. It can also be used to effect the arrest of an individual who the officer has probable cause to believe has committed a felony that caused or threatened to cause death or serious bodily harm. And a reasonable officer would believe that that individual is more likely than not to cause death or serious bodily harm to an officer or member of the public unless immediately apprehended. So essentially, in certain situations where an officer believes that that a community member may undergo serious bodily harm or death, that's kind of the only situation in which deadly force would be authorized. And then the policy also specifically limits the situations where deadly force can be used. So it cannot be used against a person who only poses a threat to themselves. It can also not be used against a person suspected of committing a misdemeanor or a nonviolent felony. And deadly force may not be used on a fleeing individual unless the use of deadly force is reasonably necessary to protect an officer or other member of the public from serious bodily harm.
Okay, thank you.
Can I add just something real quick to kind of point out a distinction between our policy and Santa Monica's? So there's actually 2 specific differences between our authorization to use deadly force and Santa Monica's. I mean, I think generally both policies allow for the use of deadly force when necessary to protect an officer or member of the public from imminent death or serious bodily harm. However, our policy actually takes this one step further. As David mentioned, and it actually requires that the death or serious bodily harm be more likely than not to occur without this use of force. And the officer must be able to, quote, specifically articulate the reasons why such force was necessary. So this language is actually not included in the Santa Monica policy.
Okay, thanks. Let's move to the next piece of this, and that is the standard for deciding how much force can be used once force is authorized. What does the model policy, the model use of force policy, have to say about that?
Sure. So the model use of force policy, it holds that the amount of force that an officer can use it must be necessary and proportional. So it must be necessary to carry out a lawful objective, which I listed the 7 lawful objectives previously. So it must be necessary to carry out a lawful objective, and the amount of force used must be proportional to the totality of the circumstances. And the model use of force policy specifically states that the amount and the type of force used must be the least required to achieve the lawful objective. So in assessing whether the use of force is necessary, an officer must consider whether a less harmful alternative is available, the severity of the suspected crime, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to safety, whether the suspect is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight, and whether the officer acted as a soundly trained police officer in the moments leading up to the use of force. And then in ensuring that the use of force is proportional, an officer is required to assess the totality of the circumstances of a given situation. And this assessment includes, but is not limited to, evaluating available de-escalation tactics, which again are always required to be used if feasible under the policy. Whether there's time to allow the suspect to submit, whether the suspect is mentally and physically capable of complying with commands, whether innocent bystanders are present who could be harmed if force is used or is not used, the reasonably foreseeable consequences and risk of escape, and the seriousness of the offense or reason for contact with the suspect.
Thank you. And how does that model use of force policy standard for using force once authorized, how does that compare to the Santa Monica standard?
Yeah, so I think the standard is actually likely the most significant difference between our policy and Santa Monica's policy. So it's important to actually understand what a standard is in the context of police use of force. And I'll try to break this down without using a bunch of legal confusing language that can be very convoluted. So once use of force is authorized, right, what we just discussed, the standard for use of force determines how much force can be used and how an officer will be evaluated on their use of force. So initially, the standard for both policies, they appear very similar, mostly because both use the language necessary and proportional, as you already heard, in determining how much force can be used. But when you look closer, the main difference between the model use of force policy standard and Santa Monica's is how an officer is evaluated on their use of force. So Santa Monica's standard for evaluation is actually based on language from Supreme Court case law that allows an officer's use of force to be judged by the average beliefs of a generalized group of officers, which was referred to earlier as the reasonable officer standard. So under Santa Monica's policy, whether use of force was necessary and proportional is evaluated by what the average officer who was on the scene at the time would believe. Our policy does not adopt this language. Instead, the model use of force policy evaluates whether use of force was necessary and proportional based on whether the least amount of force required was used given the specific circumstances present, and whether this force was commensurate with the lawful objective or the threat posed to the officer or the public. So I think ultimately the biggest difference between our standard and Santa Monica's is in how an officer's use of force is evaluated. While Santa Monica evaluates an officer's use of force based on the average officer, our policy does not.
Okay, and I take it in addition to using that standard for how an officer is evaluated, it also applies at the moment before the officer is deciding what force is to be applied.
Right.
Is that correct? It's not just evaluating it after the fact, but it's also the officer making a decision has to use the same standard in deciding what's next.
Right.
Okay. All right. Well, that covers the basic overview, and now I want to open it up to commissioner questions of either the officers that are here or the folks who have just spoken on behalf of the Stanford Center for Racial Justice. And I see Commissioner Devermont. So please go ahead.
This is actually
Devermont.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
I'm driving home from work. I apologize. I actually have a few questions, I think, for Deputy Chief Jacob, who I'm a fan of. Number one, does Santa Monica allow for the use of what I know as a rear naked choke, carotid artery choke, or a sleeper hold? And the second question is, does Santa Monica, and to what extent, employ training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, submission grappling, other forms of non-striking control?
To your first question, sir, the use of the carotid restraint has been banned. It's also been banned in the state, so it's against the law, state of California, and we do use Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. We also use several martial art forms in our training for our officers, but most recently, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, which is a post-approved tactic, so that we're no longer striking and we're more grappling and controlling folks. Yeah, yes, sir.
So I guess just to follow up is, to what extent does an officer get training in grappling, submission grappling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu? And is that training continuous? Is there refreshers, or is it just a one-time academy? You guys do your academy through the sheriffs. Am I wrong on that, or do you have your own academy?
No, you're correct, sir. Orange County.
Okay.
You're correct.
So,
And so, no, go ahead, sir. No, I was just going to answer your question. I'll listen.
No, I go ahead.
So our officers received training every year in advanced officer training. They do that between the months of April and like June, July, where they receive training. This year, this is a constant use of force training. Under our guardian strategies in the Santa Monica Police Department, every month officers will have some type of use of force training, whether that be in roll call training or pushed out through emails or review of policy. Every quarter, officers are required to go through our use of force policy, use of deadly force, our shooting policy. They get those in roll calls and in their training. There are also training bulletins that are pushed out, and then once a year, officers actually do hands-on training. What we're instituted now is that officers are going to have to do hands-on training, and part of that is de-escalation in anything that we do. So taught in our scenario-based training that we do every year is also the main component of de-escalation. Our officers also use that in our firearms training, so we make sure that when we qualify with our firearms, we're using de-escalation tactics prior to pulling the trigger in our training. That way, officers are continuously practicing de-escalation tactics.
Last question. Do you think that more consistent, more extensive submission grappling, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu training would be beneficial or helpful to Santa Monica officers, or do you think that they've kind of reached the threshold as to what's needed and attention might be better placed elsewhere?
No, I think you have to be multidisciplined in a lot of things that you do. Officers, right, we have a lot of tools on our belts, so sometimes going to the ground by yourself is not the best option or policy to do. But sometimes when we have a bunch of folks together, it's the best tactic to use. And so we let our officers decide that. And sometimes if they're overpowered and if they can hang on and put a person in a control hold until help arrives without having to shoot anyone, use a baton or use any other force option, they can hold them until they fold on, then even better. So these are a bunch of tools and a bunch of kind of that buffet of a lot of things that we offer officers to be able to handle, to be able to use at their disposal.
Thank you, Deputy Chief Jacobs. I very much appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Okay, who's next? Looks like Commissioner Centeno. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. This question's to Chief Jacobs. You said that the Santa Monica's current policy has been modified 4 times in how many years? In recent past? In the last 2 years?
Yes,
okay.
Sir.
And how often do you guys review specifically use of force or deadly use of force with contemporary standards or incidents involving other departments? Do you do that?
Yeah, constantly. It's a process that we do all the time. Our policy, like I said before, we have full-time people who monitor policy, and we have use of force. We have a use of force cadre. Some of them are on the call. Sergeant Sumlin is there. They're constantly going through policy, going through force options, going through what other departments are doing, looking what's out there, seeing if we need to be better, seeing if we need to do things better. Our policy changed during those times. One, because we changed I believe our policy initially when this commission met, before it was a commission, when it was just a committee, was we added the sanctity of life. I believe our policy said we believe in the well-being of life or something like that, but we specifically changed our policy to add the word sanctity because that was important to our community. So we have that ability to do that. We changed our law when AB 392 came. We changed our law when proportionality came. We changed our law. We changed our policy on several different times to meet those. And we meet with our city attorney to make, obviously, one of the steps that I forgot to mention is that our city attorney is always on those, included in those policy changes before they're approved by the chief and before we make any changes to make sure that we're legally set and it's defensible by the city attorney.
Okay. And when you were talking about Lexipol, you were talking about them providing the policy. To your knowledge, do you know if the department has ever received a proposed policy from Lexipol and just boilerplate use that policy as it was given to you, or do you just use a template as a starting point to adjust it to the needs and to the concerns of the community?
Yeah, that's right. And so I don't know of any policy that we've ever boilerplated put in there because we're kind of unique to any other place, right? As any other department would be, and it has to meet, our kind of standards and how we do things in our agency. So yeah, we don't just implement them in and do what they tell them. Lexipol is a policy that's based on case law, and it's based on things from the Ninth Circuit or wherever your particular police department is, and it's based on those particular court cases, and a lot of the impetus is put in. If you've ever read the policy, it talks about what a supervisor should do. It talks about what an officer should do. So it's not just a simple policy that says thou shalt not or thou shalt do this. It talks about the things that officers should consider. It talks about the things that supervisors should consider. It talks about all of those things. Listening to your colleagues speaking, our policy does speak to a lot of those things. And so, I see a lot of similarities in those policies, and not much difference. I know they may differ, but I see a lot of the same things. So it's not a boilerplate, and we're constantly, consistently changing it.
Okay, and then I have my final question or hypothetical. If I can give a hypothetical to the Stanford representatives that are here, and also to the Santa Monica Police Department's use of force expert. And the hypothetical is this, and you guys can, if you can respond to it.
Commissioner, so I'll say this, that explicitly the Stanford folks aren't going to offer expert advice on hypotheticals, but I think Deputy Chief Jacob probably is in a good place to do it.
Well, I'm just wondering if they could apply the standards of the Stanford model to a hypothetical situation. I'm just wondering if they'd be able to do that.
Well, I've asked them not to do that, but go ahead and ask your hypothetical, and let's see what Deputy Chief Jacob would say about that.
Okay. Well,
if you want to.
Okay.
Here's that's okay.
Well, I think I know, but maybe I'm wrong. So here's the situation, Chief. Under the current policy, if an officers are working hypothetically out nighttime, middle of the night, 3 o'clock in the morning or so, they receive a call from a neighbor who lives above a woman downstairs on the lower floor that he knows lives alone, and he hears her screaming or whimpering, and thinks that she may be in trouble or maybe under some sort of duress, unknown trouble call. So officers start responding to the scene. First officer arrives by himself, starts walking up to the location, when he sees a male dash from the building, half-dressed, carrying a knife, running. And the officer's by himself. Would the officer have the ability to, doesn't know the circumstances, doesn't know the condition of a potential victim, does the officer have the authorized use of deadly force in that situation? I can't hear you.
You're on mute.
I would say that it's going to you gave me just a bunch of different small facts. I would say in that particular situation, no. And only because that the officer would not know what has happened inside the place. I think the officer can certainly chase, the officer can certainly engage, and if a deadly encounter happens during that, then definitely. But can legally an officer shoot a fleeing felon in the back? Absolutely, right? We know that. But should we? And our officers, and against our in our policy, that is probably not a good shooting until the officer knows exactly what's going on inside the place. Because the other fact of catching a fleeing felon or shooting at a fleeing felon is that we have to prove that the crime is still going to occur or will continue to occur if it's not stopped at that moment in time. And so absent, the suspect is getting away or running away, then that's a particular issue. Now, I will add one caveat to your scenario. Now we're talking it's the Night Stalker, and now we have multiple people who have been raped and multiple people who've been killed, like back in the 80s, and we are in that particular area. Now same scenario, now same issue. That officer probably would be justified in shooting that person because they would then reasonably believe that they are dealing with the same suspect under those. So there's something a little bit more for that officer to believe that that's something there. And even in that scenario, I don't believe, I would hope that an officer would do their best to apprehend that suspect other than just pointing their firearm and shooting someone in the back as they're fleeing away. They have a duty to try to catch someone.
Is it fair to say, and I'm just trying to understand, so you have one policy and under different circumstances, one would be justified and one would not be justified. Same policy, same language.
That is correct, sir. Okay. That is correct. And so, I know the Mr. Pham called it the average officer policy, but it is indeed the reasonable officer standard, and it's not average, it's reasonable. And would an officer do in this particular, would a reasonable officer do in this particular circumstance when faced with the same situation? Would they use that same amount of force? Would they use those same options? Not saying that they would use the same, but is it reasonable what they did during that particular moment in time? That's what they're judged on.
Okay, and so I have a question for the Stanford again. Does what was just described under your policy meet that threshold or not meet that threshold?
Well, I've asked them not to respond to hypotheticals on the fly because there's too much opportunity for kind of misconstruing the facts or whatever. So I don't want them to answer those. They're not prepared to answer those questions.
Okay, I'm only asking.
Maybe I'll get a hypothetical from you in advance and we can take a look at it.
Okay. I see. I'm just asking because these are kinds of the situations that officers face and have to make that decision right then and there. They can't refer to a manual or get on the horn and talk to anybody about it. They got to decide right then and there what to do. And they're the only ones that got to make that decision. So these guys apparently had time to write this policy and really think about it. And now I'm just asking, apply it if you can. If you can't apply it, I'm okay with that. I'm trying to grab onto the handles here and see where do we start.
No, I understand.
If they can't, I don't want to put them in a spot if they're not comfortable. I'm good with that. I'm okay. I'm just trying to get a hold of this.
Well, I've asked them to not prepare to do that. But we could have a whole hour session on hypotheticals at some future point. Maybe we'll do that.
All right. That's all I have. Thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Miller.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you to our expert guests from both Santa Monica Police Department and from Stanford. I sure appreciate you making time for this committee meeting. The first three commissioners to pose questions, two of them are lawyers and quite good ones, and one of them is a 30-year veteran police officer. I have none of those qualities in my background, and I suspect it may show in my questions. So bear with me. I think I have basically three questions. The first one actually picks up right where Commissioner Centeno left off. I'm very interested in that concept of average officer or reasonable officer. And I guess my question, and I'd appreciate if I could get feedback both from SMPD and from Stanford. In each of your uses of that standard of average officer or reasonable officer, two questions. One is if I can get a sense of how that standard is used by SMPD and how it's used in the proposed Stanford model. And part B to that first question also is, in this discussion of average officer or reasonable officer, how do community standards or community values get roped into that or weigh into that? How does that reflected by this sense of average or reasonable officer? So two parts on that, please.
I guess we'll go first. I'm gonna defer this question to Sergeant Sumlin, who's been patiently waiting to get involved. Sergeant Sumlin.
There we go. So reasonable / average officer. Basically, you look at the circumstances that took place, and you look at that officer. You look at how long that officer has been on the job, what amount of training that they've had, and you compare it to someone who's had similar amount of training time on as that person would. A 5-year veteran versus a 10-year veteran versus a 15-year veteran versus a 20-year veteran, and the amount of training and the type of training that they've had potentially come into play. Commissioner Devermont asked about jiu-jitsu training. You look at what type of training and how much training has that officer had for them to be in a situation and how they would handle that. So that's how you would look at or try to define what a reasonable officer would do, comparing time on, training, etc.
I want to hear from Stanford too, but just to quickly piggyback on that,
Mm-hmm.
That all makes perfect sense, and it sounds to me like a very appropriate standard, but maybe not. I'm concerned about it as a singular standard. So I guess my question is, everything that you said, sir, still related to officer compared to officer, junior officer compared to senior officer. I'm interested in how does the community and the community's values or standards or desires around policing get into that loop when we're talking about comparing officers to officers?
I think it comes about from like how we're having these conversations right now, in that of the community express what their desires, concerns are, or what they would like to have take place. And I think there's got to be that conversation. I'm glad that you're coming from not being an attorney, not having 30 years. You are that person who I want to talk to explain to you why we do and why we don't do things sometimes. And then also hear, your point of view on it. And that's the thing, at the end of the day, we can either agree or we can agree to disagree sometimes. There may be reasons why we do certain things that is one of the reasons why I love the Citizens Academy. To bring people in and for them to understand why we do things a certain way. I think it has a great deal of value for any police department. But yeah, it starts with these discussions. This is how we bring what the community wants in.
Thank you. A Stanford response on that, if that would be all right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so I just want to note that our policy does not use the reasonable officer standard, so we don't include that standard in our policy. And I think it's for the reasons maybe of what you've already stated, Commissioner Miller. The reasonable officer standard is utilizing a standard that essentially looks at what other officers would do under the same circumstances at the same time, and that does not take into account a truly objective standard that allows you to actually look at the situation from a perspective that's not an officer. So you can take an example of, if you think about, say, there's a knife-wielding individual who is standing, 15, 20 feet away from the police officer. If the officer shoots and fires at that individual, maybe an average or a reasonable officer may think that's reasonable because they fear for their life. But objectively, maybe that's not a reasonable use of force because they're 10 to 15 feet away from that individual and they're only holding a knife. So I think there's just that difference. I think is very critical to our policy, and that we actually don't use the reasonable officer standard. And so I just want to make that clear.
Thank you so much, Chairman. I think I'll limit myself to just 2 questions, and if time allows, you'll circle back to me. So the second and last question for the moment is, often when there's a major case before the Supreme Court, or if there's a major policy in formulation, there's interest in who are the parties that are arguing the case, or who are the parties that are formulating the policy? So I remember, for example, when same-sex marriage was up before the Supreme Court, there was keen interest in the fact that the 2 attorneys were, one was a very prominent conservative, one was a very prominent progressive. My question is, with regard to the law firm that's donating its time to help you develop this policy, how would they be reasonably characterized? Are they considered a progressive firm, a moderate, a conservative firm? And Stanford as an institution, how is that viewed?
As a member of both communities, I would not characterize them using those terms at all. And I think you have to look at the specific attorneys who are involved in the project, and they're all deeply experienced and highly trained lawyers. And as you heard earlier, the project had involvement of several deeply experienced former federal prosecutors.
Very good. Then maybe just last piece on that. Would it be fair to say that those expert attorneys and others that were involved represented a range of philosophical view, or was there a particular bent to the involved individuals?
I hope that they didn't bring a philosophical view other than the standard articulated, and that is respect for the sanctity of life and trying to identify fair, safe, and equitable practices. And also what they explained at the outset, and what is absolutely true, is that that the project is still in a work in progress and will continue to include consultation with law enforcement officials and community advocates, grassroots organizations, and people around the full spectrum of this issue, because it's intended to be something that would be acceptable across the board. So
Thank you.
I'll say it that way. Yeah. All right. Are there any other commissioners who wish to ask questions? I see Commissioner Rahman. Thank you. Go ahead, please. You have to take yourself off mute, but this time you're not the first one to do it.
Sorry. So I just have one question, and I'll keep it brief. When you try to de-escalate a situation, or when you're, because most of the times these are split-second decisions that you have to make. My question is, if you see that the individual is of a different nationality or perhaps doesn't understand English, is that in any of your policies? Do you type different languages? Or if you see that, hey, this person could fall into whatever category, do you always determine that the person understands your commands in English? Or do you go with whatever the situation is?
Absolutely. I saw my colleague, Sergeant Sumlin's jumped on, so I'll let him answer the question.
Thank you.
I would say it's twofold. It's not only, it's a matter of trying to see whether or not the person understands us at all. It may not be just a language barrier. It could also be a mental barrier too. And if the person doesn't understand me or is not comprehending what I'm saying to them, then I can't communicate to that person. And with that being the case, then I have to evaluate the situation, come up with other potential tactic. I may have to, depending what the circumstances are, go on physical with the person. It may be a situation I'm able to stand off, get additional bodies there, and then try to maybe swarm the person. But yeah, the person being able to understand what I'm saying, I can't de-escalate if they don't understand me or what my intentions are.
And just so we're clear, in the law change in the state of California, it addresses that. It addresses that through deadly force that the legislature knows and understands that a high degree of uses of force have occurred upon folks with mental illness. So that happens in our training, right? And so we know that sometimes they just don't understand what's going on, right? And which leads to sometimes bad outcomes, right? Because officers are thrust headlong in to a situation where they go, well, we knew we were just asking for help, right? And the officer comes, and then the officer now is encountered with the particular subject performing some type of violence, and they can't help, and de-escalation is out the window. And so these are hard situations to make, and they're split-second judgments that have to be made at an instant that could determine someone's life. So we take that very seriously at the Santa Monica Police Department.
Thank you both.
Commissioner Centeno.
Thank you. I just have a question. Has this model policy that Stanford has been working on, has it been adopted, or are you still, I think you said it's still kind of being...
We're still in the work in progress.
Work in progress? Okay. Yeah. Any departments that you're willing to identify as working with the Stanford model so that, maybe they can give you expert feedback on the evolution of your policy?
None that I'm going to identify right now, but would love to have Deputy Chief Jacob join in on some of the conversations.
Okay, but you do have other agencies that are working with you?
We have extensive relationships with folks in law enforcement, and we're going to be using them and interacting with them as we work on the project and recruiting more. So
great. Thanks.
Okay. Looks like Commissioner Miller.
Thank you. To our guests from Santa Monica Police Department, reference was made in your presentation to, I think, four recent occurrences where the policy has been updated, if I heard that correctly. So I think my question is, at the time of May 31st of 2020, were the actions that took place on Ocean Avenue viewed as being consistent with or contrary to the then prevailing policy? And then let's fast forward to after those 3 or 4 recent occasions where the policy has been updated. Would that affect whether the actions of that occurred on 5/31 under the new policy, would that have been deemed any different than the actions as they were viewed under the old policy?
Very good question, Commissioner Miller. I think the policies are similar, although there's a lot more to go into it. And now our First Amendment policy has changed, obviously, in the things that we've done, but more our tactics have changed. And so if we were to apply what we do now versus May 31st, it would totally night and day, totally different. So our tactics are different. It's not really a policy change, if you will. It's a perception change in ourselves. And so how we address First Amendment assemblies and now applying our laws to now affect our new thought process, new process on how we deal with those. If that makes sense.
I appreciate the answer, and just to explore a bit, your opinion. If it's a matter of tactic and not a matter of policy, then it would seem that the individuals on duty and guiding tactic would have the most to do with what action has taken place, as opposed to if it's a matter of policy, which would tend to transcend whether we have the good fortune of a chief like the police chief we currently have, or were we to become less fortunate at some future date?
Well, I think, all this happened before our new chief got here,
Yeah.
but he totally agrees. So our tactics changed, so our policy changed. It wasn't a policy change, then our tactics changed, right? We recognized some things through the OIR report, and how we did that. So our tactics changed, so our policy had to change to match the policy, to match our tactics.
Okay, so it does, but just to recap, the principal change is in how you would tactically approach this, and how that affected policy was I think you described it as as some change, but not really significant policy. Is that a fair statement?
I don't think I'm understanding the question, sir.
Okay.
I'm trying to follow you, but I think I'm
all right. Were there significant policy changes between what was in effect on 5/31 and what's in effect now, or is the principal change the way the personnel currently in power and currently on duty and or in power would approach it from a tactical standpoint? So is it a tactical preference and change in understanding as to what's preferred, perhaps based on the 5/31 experience, or does it go beyond that, and are there actually significant changes in the written?
I don't think that there's significant changes in the written policy. I think there are more significant changes in how we do business. When we go back and we think about de-escalation, right? We've always kind of done de-escalation. We've been teaching de-escalation for years before it even had a name. But now we needed policy to reflect that, and a training program to reflect that. And now it's this big thing, but we've been doing it for a while. So now our policy changes to match our practice on what we actually do. So, right, as I remember Commissioner Brown said a long time ago, right, practice eats policy for breakfast every day, right? Practice. And so, and that's true, right? So our practice, our tactics, and everything that we do, policy has to match that, or you find yourself astray. And occasionally we do find ourselves in some of those scenarios on little things, and then wait, that's not how we do it. We need to update our policy or fix how we do it to match our policy. That makes sense.
It does, and maybe just one last quick piece on that. Sometimes the policy changes, and I had a brief exchange with Interim Chief Seabrook on this. Sometimes the policy changes are principally take the form of reiterating what the policy is. And you made reference to reviews at roll call, or the sending of emails, and perhaps a ratcheting up of the frequency of those things. With regards to the use of force policy, is that principally the kinds of changes that we're talking about when you describe some changes to policy, or are they beyond the frequency of the reiteration of policy?
Yeah, so I think it's a little bit of both, right? So it's about, right, so again, our use of force policy, I believe, covers our use of force policy covers not just a use of force policy, but like 21 different other topics that it discusses. So it's not just a one blanket policy, and so that changes. Our use of force policy is our use of force policy, and it's changed because of law. It's changed because of different wording that needs to be made clear. It's changed at the suggestion of the city attorney. All of these things, and maybe even some at the behest of this commission. But regardless, right, we have to make sure that we're training to that particular policy, whatever that is, and we have to be consistent with that. And if we can do it, if it's a doable thing, and so remember, we have all these policies, and officers have to understand what's going on. They have to be able to make these decisions in a split second, and then do what they have to do in those particular instances. And so the use of the carotid restraint is outlawed. We don't do it. Before the state made it illegal, we banned it. And so that then, right, so if an officer has to change their policy, we can't even teach it anymore, right? We don't do anything with it. So if an officer uses it, going back, so we have to untrain that trained thought that if this particular situation happens, then this. We actually have to untrain it. And so that's difficult. That's not exactly easy. And Sergeant Sumlin's been part of those groups that have done that.
Thank you so much. Appreciate your answers.
All right. Well, I think we've given all the commissioners an opportunity to ask questions. So I'm going to thank our guests for appearing. Hope we haven't scared you off from appearing at future Use of Force Systems Committee meetings. And then, as we do with all committee meetings, we provide an opportunity for public input on matters that are within the scope of this committee, but not agenda items. So if there are any members of the public who have anything they want to say, you can turn on your camera at this time and I'll recognize you. Okay, I don't see any. So, Ms. Johnstone, please.
Call me Bonnie. It's okay. I would just love to hear from the police officers who are attending tonight who have not spoken. I would appreciate hearing some of their thoughts on what was discussed tonight.
Yeah, understood. But I'm sorry, but structurally, I'm trying to stay within the rules, and the way I'm instructed on how to operate the committees is that we get public input at the beginning, we have the discussion among the commissioners, and then at the end, the public input is supposed to be general public input, and so we're not going to circle back and answer questions. And it's not that I wouldn't love to have them answer your question, it's just that if I start a practice, then I have to do it at all the committee meetings, and so I'm going to draw the line on that. I'm sorry.
I hope there's opportunity in the future.
I suspect there will be. Did I see Ms. Whittick? Or not? Nope. Okay, Mr. Ali?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
I'm trying to get a sense of an objective in regards to how we can move forward with what is obviously a difference between two similarly, I guess you could say, situated police forces that deals with communities of equal size, where there is more of a, I guess you could say, cautionary check balance thing in light of what we've been experiencing here in Santa Monica, if that's a fair question. What incentive, could the department look at in terms of wanting to establish that policy? Because it makes sense to me from a community point of view, because it looks like it's a safer thing. So I'm wondering, from a department policy standpoint, is there incentive for them to more or less look at that as well, if that could be answered?
Okay. Well, I thank you for your comment, and I think what we'll do with some of these is we'll obviously the department is listening, and at a future Use of Force Committee meeting, we'll revisit some of these questions. But thank you for the question, and thanks for your comment. Was there, Ms. Whittick, were you trying to get on?
Yes, she is trying to get on. She's
Okay.
raised her hand in the
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks. Yeah. Just looking back at the two standards that we heard about this evening, the one from the Stanford group and from SMPD, it does appear that SMPD is using this reasonable officer standard, whereas Stanford is looking toward somewhat more objective standard. And I would just like to say that when you use the reasonable officer standard, it is a little bit more backward looking and reinforces the status quo to the extent that a reasonable officer is in fact reasonable given those officers who are already on the job. In psychology, we talk about this as somewhat of a self-fulfilling prophecy. you select those people for a particular kind of position based on those who have succeeded in that vocation in the past. Well, if all of the people who have been in that vocation in the past have been of a certain type, then choosing new people to admit to that vocation is backward looking. It reinforces the status quo. So I really applaud the Stanford group for trying to find a standard that is not just looking at what the reasonable officer who already is employed by departments would do, but looking for something more objective. The challenge is how to define that operationally. It's a good aspiration, but I'm not sure how it can be achieved. So that's something to work on.
Thank you for your comment. Okay. I'm not seeing any others with their hands raised. So I'm going to once again thank everyone for attending and appreciate all of your input and your time, and especially members of the public who are also taking their time to pay attention and come to these meetings. So thanks everyone, and the meeting is adjourned. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Listen, try Boost High Protein with 20 grams of protein for muscle health versus 60.
Vitafusion gummy vitamins. Results. Yeah. Like a karate door. My windshield cracked. I chose Safe Light.
But everything else is all screwed up. Everything you do for students, basically. Some of the crazy officers oh shit. We're looking at whatever you're looking at, and that is the truth. We do the best we can. We do have a staff monitor that is right next to us. Brian Hagan, who does the stats, is there, and he'll help us out, handing us some things. Investigations fall on a 6-foot floor. He's isolated like that you'll ever be. He's going to turn to a shot. The baseline is beautiful. Smooth. His second game back. Anthony
Greetings. Good evening.
That was a good question that you asked.
What do you think?
Well, of course, they couldn't answer it, could they? They're not allowed to answer public comment.
I see. That's what I was wondering, if indeed it was a clear thing. Because for me, well, first and foremost, this thing Thursday, is that a similar session?
Hey.
It was only a study session, and that means that there'll be a deeper dive into specific topics. The big topic for that day will be the complaints process. What do they do about complaints? How do they track them? Do they welcome them? Does the person get an adequate answer? Is the officer held accountable if they're found to have violated policy? So that's a big and interesting topic on Thursday.
Mm-hmm. Hold on for a second.
They have several other things on their agenda too, but I think that's the big one that people will want to weigh in
on. Michelle.
All right. Yeah. I thought I was hearing feedback off my iPad. Could you repeat it one more time?
Yes.
All right. Let me throw this in because at our last PRJ session, we were cyber hacked and we made a complaint. And we're not even sure how, and what has me upset is the idea that we're, looking at and doing that process and what we've gone through with these folks is not very much true. Well, in addition to this, Michelle, I'm getting the sense this is the third person of color, who in essence supervises a group of white folks, and these white folks are lackadaisical about one investigating the improper white folks who have broken the law. That's my sense, and so I don't know if it can be lodged as a complaint, but it's clearly an observance. Okay. All right. So I'm not alone in this. Okay. All right. Well, let me answer that question by saying this. And a while back, I think it was you or somebody close to you that, gave the scenario, well, this is a paramilitary thing. And essentially, they conduct themselves as a paramilitary thing. So my question now is, well, okay, are we talking about when we deal with bad cops, are we talking about war crimes? And so, your question, I think, hinges upon if indeed they see themselves as paramilitary, and all because they're involved in war. See what I'm saying? So, I mean, when I hear your question, that's where I go. Anything other than that, backs up the idea that, in war, you can do no wrong. But it's a soul. Yeah, it's a soul, the difference between a soldier still a soldier, whether he's in Kuwait or he's in Iraq. In Afghanistan, he's still a soldier. Now, of course, if you have, a non-hostile, Kuwait is a non-hostile, thing where, everybody is the ally, and Iraq isn't, but it's still, that person that has, look at this in that respect. So, that's the way I see it. That's the way I see it. It's my intent. All right.